Since the beginning of this generation, Insomniac has stood as one of Sony's strongest internal developers, having shipped 4 games on PlayStation 5 thus far, with more on the way. Insomniac has been busy, but what I love about this studio is how they're constantly looking to push their technology while supporting new features. After all, Insomniac was one of the first to embrace 40 frames per second output for 120Hz screens, as well as one of the first to go all in on ray tracing on consoles with the launch of PlayStation 5. What I didn't expect, however, was Insomniac going back and updating each and every one of their PS5 titles to support the new PS5 Pro, but that's what they've done. And today I want to lay out these changes in this video, beginning with Marvel's Spider-Man 2. The gist then is simple. Insomniac has implemented Sony's new PSSR feature to improve image quality while offering additional ray tracing options that were not available on the base system. Combine this with the various frame rate options and you have quite a wide range of choices on display with the Pro. Compared to the original, the selection of modes has changed completely. You still technically have a performance and quality mode, but what they do differs when played on a PS5 Pro. Insomniac's already good temporal injection solution has been replaced with the new PSSR. The internal resolution metrics are certainly comparable. Performance mode is around 1440p for instance, but thanks to PSSR, more detail is resolved, which you can see here on this sign. The text becomes legible on the Pro, whereas it's rather blurry on the original system. The fidelity mode, like the original game as well, aims for higher resolutions closer to 4K, and again, PSSR pays off in terms of stabilizing the image. If you compare Performance Pro and Fidelity Pro, the extra detail is certainly visible and welcome, especially at a distance. It's sharper and more temporally stable all around. Perhaps the easiest way to appreciate this is using the game's main menu. With depth of field disabled, this distant view demonstrates the advantage of Fidelity mode quite nicely. Increased temporal stability and detail. Still, while I do feel the upgrade is certainly worthwhile, I think most users would agree that it's not really worlds away from the original game. It's the type of situation where you really need to keep in mind your viewing distance and the type of television in use when making a decision on the PS5 Pro. There are other factors here as well. These numbers are for the default 30 or 60 FPS modes, but if you have a 120Hz capable VRR display, you gain access to additional options. As with the base version, there's a 40 FPS mode, along with uncapped options for both modes. What I found is that this can influence the average resolution figures ever so slightly, but with PSSR, the difference is a lot less noticeable than with the base PS5. The other ray tracing settings, when combined with the uncapped fidelity mode, can also exert a slight influence on dynamic res, but it's largely negligible. I'll get to performance numbers later, but first let's tackle the next question. What other sorts of changes exist between Performance Pro and Fidelity Pro modes aside from resolution and the introduction of PSSR? Well, we know that additional ray tracing features are available, but what else? Firstly, things such as draw distance, distant reflections, increased detail at proximity, and even additional lights are all present in the quality mode. You can clearly see that in scenes like this. The traffic light, for instance, is more detailed when in fidelity mode. The quality mode simply pushes details further out into the distance. Things like trees and buildings are more detailed in fidelity mode. Plus, you can actually see building reflections from across the map, which are not present in the performance mode. Really good stuff. The actual ray tracing features, however, are slightly trickier to show off. Keep in mind that this game was not created with these features in mind. I found that they added some additional detail to the image for sure, but it's clear that the game itself was not designed around them. So what do they actually do then? Well, I want to start here on the main menu. You see, you can flip between the modes in real time and directly see the impact on the 3D scene behind the menu. This is really useful as it helps you understand what to look for when comparing the options. Even if you lack the eye for such detail, this view shows what each setting changes as you click left and right. You can suddenly spot things like the extra shadow detail at a distance, or the improved contact shadows. But let's fire up some other comparisons from across the game, shall we? Starting with the top option, RT Key Light Shadows. It's a slightly curious name, but it essentially refers to distant sun shadows. That is, when the sun casts light down across the map, the buildings and structures should cast shadows, but by default, they really don't at a distance. Distant shadows are always a tricky thing to handle, but thanks to ray tracing, you now see distant shadows that were otherwise not displayed. There's actual depth now in the scene if you look out across the city, which is something you're likely to do in a game like this with Spider-Man swinging way above the city. Now, I wouldn't say this is a game-changing feature or anything. It's really only something you'll notice when taking in the long-distance views, for instance, but it definitely helps everything feel a little bit more alive overall. If you're using fidelity mode, I certainly recommend enabling this option. I haven't noticed any negative side effects from using it. Next up, ray traced reflections and interiors. There's now a high option, which essentially renders all reflections at full resolution rather than half, matching the current main scene rendering resolution. This means that both the reflections themselves show more detail, along with the interior spaces. Look here, you can see jagged edges and a softness to the interior space when using the medium setting that is erased when switching to high. Remember, these interior spaces use a clever trick which lends the buildings the impression of actual depth behind the glass. They're using a series of rooms present beneath the game world map that they can trace into to properly light and display these interior spaces. It's very slick and it looks better here on the Pro. That said, while the new high-resolution RT reflections and interiors do make a difference, it does not actually increase the detail of what's contained within the game's BVH structure. That means you'll still be seeing lower resolution textures and simplified objects reflected back in the glass, something you could overcome in the PC versions of prior Spider-Man games. I was hoping we might see this improve on PS5 Pro, but alas, that's not the case. It simply boosts the resolution. Still, I recommend it. Lastly, we have RTAO, Ray Traced Ambient Occlusion. This is a very subtle feature, but one that adds more accurate contact shadows across the scene. You can see along these edges here on this building. Now, it's also visible from the aforementioned title screen. For instance, look under Spider-Man's wrist. Yeah, it's subtle, but it's in shadow, and RTAO ensures that it's properly shadowed, whereas the performance mode allows light to leak through. This aerial shot also shows shadows around the base of the building as a result of RTAO. There's another interesting thing here. The high setting adds a screen space GI component that is rather subtle. Essentially, this means that light reflecting off of different surfaces can somewhat color the surroundings. Like in this scene, we get a slight orange glow from the sunlight reflecting off the brick building. Still, I feel like this is in the nice to have category, but if you're playing in fidelity mode, you may as well enable this feature as it does add some nice subtle details to each scene. Taken together, all three of these new RT features do add some nice depth to the overall presentation, and fidelity mode winds up looking even better. As you can see though in these side-by-sides, it can often be difficult to pinpoint the effect of these at a glance. And this kind of ties back into what I suggested earlier. The game's art really wasn't designed with these RT features in mind, so the impact is reduced. Still, when you open up that options menu, you might be wondering what is the better choice for you in terms of playability, and that's where performance comes into play. So the fidelity mode has several modes of functions. On a normal 60Hz display, it's limited to just 30 frames per second. But when you connect to a 120Hz VRR display, you gain access to a capped 40 FPS mode, which we love here at Digital Foundry, and an uncapped VRR mode. The 30 and 40 modes both seem to lock to their respective targets in our tests, but the uncapped mode appears to run in the 50s when coupled with VRR, and feels rather smooth indeed. Unfortunately, we cannot capture VRR for performance analysis, and the low frame rate compensation ensures that even the LG overlay cannot properly display what the frame rate really is. This is the kind of thing where you're just going to need to see it for yourself to see if you like the way it looks. All of this is achieved with excellent image quality and all ray tracing features engaged. If you disable these features, it actually has a rather minimal impact on performance, suggesting that the game is still bottlenecked somewhere else in this mode. And keep in mind that fidelity mode does more than just adding additional ray tracing features. Now, if you fancy that higher frame rate, of course, the Performance Pro mode will offer you that. Ray tracing remains enabled, but only the standard features that we saw in the original release of the game. This one does contain PSSR, of course, so image quality is better, but that's really the main difference. This one manages to run at a stable 60 FPS in 60 Hz mode. Like the original though, you can remove the frame rate cap in this mode as well, using VRR to smooth things out. In my tests, moving across the world, the game basically averages between 60 to 70 frames per second. So while it is improved over 60, it isn't exactly by a huge margin. Still, if you are on such a display and using the performance mode, you may as well turn it on. And that's an important thing to consider, because if you do have a 120Hz VRR display, I actually recommend switching to Fidelity Pro mode with the frame rate cap disabled. But if you only have a 60Hz screen, then performance mode is perhaps the way to go, because otherwise you'll be limited to just 30 frames per second. Now, as I mentioned back at the beginning of this video, Insomniac has updated all of their PS5 games, not just the second Spider-Man. Yes, Spider-Man 2 has the most robust feature set, of course, but the options are actually rather similar on prior games, such as Ratchet and Clank. Like Spider-Man, Ratchet includes a new Fidelity Pro and Performance Pro mode, and these two modes function exactly as you'd expect. In Fidelity Pro mode, you gain access to PSSR, RTAO, and improved RT reflections. The only thing missing is the key light shadow options, which was added for Spider-Man 2, but this makes sense in Ratchet given how different the worlds are. Aside from this, however, all the same benefits apply. Reflections are now pin sharp, and, due to the smaller scope perhaps, show more detail on average. They look fantastic. The reflections are all very clean and mostly free of artifacts and motion. RTAO is similarly subtle as we saw in Spider-Man 2, but I still think it's worth enabling as the performance cost is low. But here's the real kicker. The performance is also a lot higher than Spider-Man 2. Now, I can't easily show this, unfortunately, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier, but the Fidelity Pro mode manages to average between 50 and 60 frames per second, I'd wager, which means you can enjoy the highest resolution with all RT effects enabled while achieving nearly 60 frames per second. Thanks to VRR, it feels extremely smooth and is a marked upgrade over the original game's Fidelity mode. What you're seeing here is what the game ultimately looks like in this mode too. Just imagine this image quality with an extra 20 to 30 frames per second. It doesn't really seem to knock the resolution scaler. The performance mode, of course, also benefits with numbers that are higher on average than Spider-Man 2. And there's no longer an option to disable ray tracing at all. It's always on the PS5 Pro, which makes sense. Now, I haven't had a chance to go back and check out the original 2 Spider-Man games, mind you, but I gather they still use the same options as Ratchet and probably benefit similarly. So really, when you step back, the key takeaway from this is pretty simple. The new Pro-specific features are not mind-blowing by any means, but they're all very welcome and transfer already beautiful games into something that's even more impressive to behold. But more than anything, I really want these titles to serve as an example to other developers when it comes to implementing user-facing technical features. You see, these are very much mass-market games, Spider-Man especially, yet Insomniac is still driven to include things such as 40 frames per second output, or embracing 120Hz and VRR on top of their already excellent ray tracing work. Crucially, every option produces good results. It simply leaves things up to the player to adjust it to their liking. So that's my takeaway then on the PS5 Pro patches for Insomniac's games. But there's so many other things to look at across the system, some great, some not so much, and we'll have a lot more on that soon. But for now, that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for watching.